Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of Smoke and Spirits. It's quite windy out here, but welcome to episode 9 and welcome to the Sandbanks Provincial Park here in lovely Prince Edward County. And I've chosen this site to do something special for you tonight. So we are going to take on the Talisker signature ritual. And we're going to see what that looks like in just one moment. All right, so for those of you that aren't familiar with the Talisker signature ritual, it involves oysters and Talisker. So the tagline for Talisker, and we'll talk about this when I'm back at the office, my usual locale, but the tagline for Talisker is that it's made by the sea. So nothing goes better with Talisker than some oysters. So I've got here some North Atlantic oysters that we're going to enjoy with a little bit of Talisker. So if you're not familiar with shucking oysters, you've got sort of the underside part that is kind of like a curved shape, like a cup shape, and then the flat side at the top. So you want to keep the curved side down because that holds what's called the oyster liquor. And there's actually a liquid that's inside here that is pretty tasty, and that's what we're going to use. So you got your oyster shucking knife that you're going to use. You got to jam it in sort of where the two shells meet. Try not to stab yourself in the hand. If you don't have an oyster knife, you can use a flathead screwdriver or a butter knife as well, okay? So I'm gonna try really hard not to stab myself in the hand for you guys. You might have to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of wedging there. Once you find the spot, you'll know it pretty much right away. And it'll just pop open for you, just like that. And keep that cup shape down so you can save some of that oyster liquor, okay? And then you've got your oyster right here. So you're just gonna sort of pry it up a little bit, and it is mushy for sure. And now you got your oyster. It's going to be really briny, it's going to be salty, absolutely delicious. And as promised, you're going to want to make sure that you've got your ushka beha at the ready. Okay, because this is what's going to happen. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Talisker signature ritual. I'll see you back at the office. But mostly the blood of Scots, from Maidenkirk to John O'Groats. The king of drinks, as I conceive it, Talisker, Islay, or Glenlivet. That's Robert Louis Stevenson talking about his return to Scotland in the poem The Scotsman's Return from Abroad. And he specifically mentions Talisker. There's no denying that Talisker is a special whiskey. First and foremost, it comes from the only distillery on the Isle of Skye. And the Isle of Skye is one of those small islands in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. So it's an archipelago and there's a bunch of little islands. And actually, when people talk about Islay single malts, a lot of the times they sort of involuntarily or subconsciously lump in all of the other ones from the islands. So you've got the Isle of Skye, Jura, Harris, Arran. All those small islands also have their claim to fame when it comes to making really good single malt whiskey. I really like Talisker. It was one of the very first single malts that I ever tried. So it really colored my experience of all the single malts that I tried after that. And it certainly is it's a medium peated Scotch whiskey, so it's not as heavy as some of the Ardbeg expressions, but you definitely get some of the peat from it. I've got here the 10-year, and the 10-year is their flagship expression, and it's the one that tends to get the most attention. It certainly has won a lot of awards. A lot of the Talisker expressions as a whole have won awards. This one just always seems to come out on top. And it is one of my favorites for that very reason. There's a lot of stuff to like about it. Now, in addition to our little trip to the beach, and I hope you enjoyed that, it was something I'd always wanted to do. It's a Talisker signature ritual, and it involves drinking Talisker from an oyster shell. And the tagline for Talisker, as I mentioned at the beach, is made by the sea. There's no denying that. When you try Talisker single malt, you definitely get a lot of the brine and the sea air, as well as the smoke and the peat and the iodine. It's very heavy with that, but it comes with some fairly surprising nosing and tasting notes. So we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. Something else I'm going to play around with tonight is this glass. This is called the NEAT glass, and NEAT is an acronym. It stands for Naturally Engineered Aroma Technology. And for the longest time, the Glencairn glass was the way to go when it came to tasting Scotch or tasting whiskey. And the difference between the two is with the Glencairn glass, you notice that it comes to sort of a narrower opening at the top. That's called a convergent rim. This one is the exact opposite, and you can see the rim at the top flares out. It's a divergent rim. The idea behind this glass is that it allows those really powerful ethanol vapors to dissipate, so you can see the actual body of the glass is even wider, so there's more surface area there for the ethanol vapors to dissipate, and as they come out of the top, they dissipate a little bit more as well. So the concept behind it is that you shouldn't get zapped too much with those really powerful alcohol vapors. Now, as you can see, I've sort of started a little experiment here before I turned the camera on, and I have to say that I'm really pleasantly surprised by this. A lot of the times when it comes to stuff that rises up as a challenger to something that's tried and true, like the Glencairn glass, you sort of take it with a grain of salt, because something's worked for that long, there's got to be some truth to it. And certainly I love the Glencairn glasses that I have. The Copita glass I'm quite fond of as well. But this is a welcome addition to my collection, because as you get closer, you can put your nose almost directly in this glass, and all you get is the nosing aromas. You just get those things that you're looking for without getting your nostrils singed by the heavy ethanol. So I'm going to top up my glass a little bit here, because like I said, my experiment earlier started before you guys got here, and that's okay. All right, so again, the Talisker 10-year. It's probably the very first one I tried, and I'm not going to lie, I tried this one because I forget which James Bond film it is, but Pierce Brosnan was playing James Bond, and I think it might have been GoldenEye or something, and he goes in to talk to M, and he has a drink of Talisker. And Talisker actually shows up in other forms of popular media. I believe that in Good Omens, one of the characters there is quite fond of Talisker Scotch. So it has made its mark in more ways than one. The distillery itself, I believe, was established in 1830, and they opened their doors in 1831. They kind of got off to a bit of a rocky start, but they soon found their feet and were well on their way to producing some excellent whiskey. Looking at this drink that I've got in my hand, it's got a very deep amber color, but I'm not seeing very much of the red tones that we had been seeing with the other expressions that we looked at. So one of the ones that I tried recently that I'm going to bring on here to show you guys is the Ardbeg Black edition. But the other ones that had sort of those reddish hues, Ugadal had a little bit of that as well. And we looked at the Kilchoman 9th edition as well. And as you will remember from when we tried those out, you know that when there's a bit of a reddish hue to your whiskey, it's usually because it's been aged in a cask that once held red liquid, whether it's red wine or sherry or something like that. In this case, it is a rich golden color, but it's more amber, and that's because this one was aged in American oak casks, which is pretty standard. But it's a very pleasing color nonetheless. Now, as I mentioned, you can really get right down into this glass. So I don't receive any compensation from any companies or anything like that for using these products or these glasses, but I can say that probably if you're an enthusiast, you can't go wrong by picking one of these up because it will give you something interesting to try, if nothing else, with the whiskey or with any drink that you enjoy. So I originally got this because I also like tequila, and I had wanted a special glass to enjoy my tequila with, because there's a drink that also has some pretty unique nosing notes and tasting notes. But I tried it with the scotch, and it was a very pleasant experiment. So getting right in, there's a very light odor of green apple. And there's the salt as well. So they're not kidding when they say it's made by the sea. And depending on who you talk to, we talked about the concept of terroir, meaning that your product, your whiskey or whatever it is, will pick up certain characteristics based on where it's from. And a lot of distilleries sort of swear by that, and they'll leave their whiskey, their casks outside to age and like soaking in those ocean winds and the salt spray and all that stuff. And it certainly appeals to the romantic in me, and I think probably if you are an enthusiast of single malt scotch, there's probably a little bit of that romantic in you as well, and you probably enjoy sort of those visions that you get in your head when you taste a really good scotch, you know, of the storm-washed coasts and the stormy skies and the craggy coastline. So it's all very picturesque, but certainly this one is no exception, and you do get a lot of that imagery when you smell it. So I got green apple right off the nose. I've got a very light sort of salt brine breeze there. But it's mostly that. It's mostly just a bit of tang and a little bit of green apple for me. It's got a very well-rounded mouthfeel. It's not super thick or oily, and a lot of times you will get that with the really peaty single malts. People will talk about like a very oily mouthfeel, and excuse me, I don't have COVID, just to reassure everybody. I know that's what you were thinking. So that oily mouthfeel is actually for a very interesting reason. So when the whiskey is distilled, the vapors will rise up through the line arms, and depending on sort of the angle of those line arms, you may get a little bit more of the heavier flavors in the oils making their way down into the finished product. So it's all quite an interesting science, and if you're interested in that stuff, again, I'm going to recommend that book by Andrew Jefford, Peat and Smoke. It's a very interesting read. But this one doesn't have that. This one is not super oily on the mouthfeel, but it is well balanced. You do get fairly heavy iodine, peat, and smoke, and that smoke comes across like a bit of a charred wood, or maybe even like a hint of charred meat, which is not unpleasant. It actually balances out really well with just a very faint undertone of those green apples that we talked about. With a lot of the other whiskeys that I've tried, green apples typically sort of falls into that same category as other fruits. So when you say maybe there's green apple notes, you may also detect things like what they call stone fruit, you know, peaches, apricots, and things like that. But that's not present here. It very much is like an apple, green apple sort of aroma or tasting note. But there's no denying that it is, it's got a really good, robust peat to it. And of course it is peated during the production of it, but the water that comes from, I believe it's Hawk Hill. So the Talisker Distillery draws its water from a place called Hawk Hill, and that water flows over peat. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people might say that makes no difference and it doesn't really matter sort of where the water comes from. Other people are very strong believers in the quality of their water and where it comes from, and what it might pass through to get to where it's going. So the water for Talisker flows over peat. And one of the things I think is really fascinating about peat, if you don't know anything about peat, is that the production of peat is an incredibly slow process. And if you don't know exactly what it is, it's decaying vegetation that is decaying in an anaerobic fashion. There's no oxygen involved, so it takes a really, really long time, sorry, to the point where only 1 millimeter of peat is produced every year. And when I first found that out, I had a bit of a panic attack, because I thought, you know, what are we going to do if Scotland runs out of peat? We're all going to be up the creek, because, you know, how are you going to get your peated whiskies? I've done a little bit of reading there, a little bit of panicked Googling to try to get to the bottom of it, and I guess there's no danger of that happening anytime soon. Certainly wouldn't want to cause a panic and a rush on your local liquor store to buy up all the peated whiskeys, but it couldn't hurt. More peated whiskey in the house is never a bad thing. So peat is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a very precious resource, and it involves vegetation that's been decaying over a very, very, very long time, sometimes to the tune of about 1,000 years. And certainly you may not believe in terroir, but I think the quality of peat has something to do with it as well. And I thought it was really interesting when I started comparing the Talisker to other peated whiskeys. Because with the Talisker, one of the things I thought was very fascinating, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that along with the smoke and the peat and the iodine, I get a very definite taste and aroma of wildflowers. So I've got a little bit of clover in there. There's like a bit of a lavender as well. And overall, there's a very definite presence of what I think of as vegetal odors and aromas and tasting notes, which is kind of a departure from a lot of the other peated single malts that I've tried. And it's for that reason that I think Talisker is very special, among other things, is because it takes that idea of peat and it uses peat in its production, not just in the production of the whiskey, but in the water itself. And it brings to it sort of what I imagine the peat is actually comprised of. So if we're talking about vegetation that's been decaying, certainly it stands to reason that whatever vegetation once existed there is a part of those strata and has made its way into this remarkable whiskey. So I don't know if I'm way off base, but since I do detect those odors and those tasting notes, that's what I tend to think of, is that once upon a time, this peat was a vibrant field of wildflowers, maybe a bit of lavender in there. And it's pleasant. It's a bit of an acquired taste. So if you're not fond of peated whiskey to begin with, this one might put you off because it does have a strong peat presence to it. And if you're not terribly open-minded when it comes to trying new Scotch, the vegetal, sort of flowery, maybe a little bit soapy odors and flavors might put you. It's not even toffee. It's almost like a burnt caramel. And it doesn't immediately identify itself as caramel when I taste this. It's more just like a thick sweetness that underlies the smoke and the peat and the iodine, and maybe a bit of seaweed. The finish is not super long. It's quite short, actually, so it's fairly clean, but it is a little bit peppery. So it leaves you with a little bit of a tingle there, a little bit of pepper. I wouldn't say that it's, anything super unique in terms of the pepperiness of it. It's not like the pink peppercorns or anything like that. It's just a peppery finish, what I might associate with like a coarse ground black pepper or something like that. But it's got a really good body to it. Like I said, it's not an oily mouthfeel, but it is rich and it's complex. There's a lot of flavors there, and as always, I would encourage everybody to sort of reevaluate your drink every time you go back for another sip. So start with your nosing, get into the mouthfeel, and then the tasting notes every time you go back to your glass, and you might find something different every time. This one I believe is 45.8 alcohol by volume. So it's not light. It's not as heavy. It's not what I would consider to be in that sort of cask strength category that we talked about, but it's very respectable. And if you're fond of richly flavored peated whiskeys, you can't go wrong with this one. So this is a Talisker 10-year, and as I said, you probably find this at most good liquor stores. There are other expressions from Talisker. The Talisker Storm is the other one that I've tried, but I know there are more of them out there. But when it comes to this particular distillery, this is one I'll always come back to, and it's won a bunch of awards for good reason. So if you have the opportunity to pick this up and try it, do so. If you have the opportunity to conduct the Talisker signature ritual, that's something pretty special as well, because you do have some definite salt here, some brine, and you've got the seaweed and the peat and the iodine and the smoke in the Talisker 10-year. It pairs very well with freshly shucked oysters. So get yourself an oyster knife or a flathead screwdriver or butter knife or something, get some fresh oysters, and try that out for yourself if you're fond of oysters. That also tends to be an acquired thing, and if you're not into it, that's fine. But the oysters themselves, when you break them open and you eat them, come with a little bit of that oyster liquor, and it's the liquid that's inside there, and it does have the taste of oysters, but also the brine of ocean water, and it pairs wonderfully with something like this. I mean, you could probably do it with other peated Islay whiskeys. This one is from Skye, but you know what I'm talking about. And you'd probably just have a similar tasting experience. But do yourself a favor if you do get the opportunity and try out the Talisker signature ritual. Failing that, because I realize oysters are going out of season now, pick up a bottle of this stuff and take your time with it. Drop a water there because it is 45.8. Try it with a Copita, try it with a Glencairn. If you get a chance for this neat glass and naturally engineered aroma technology, give it a try and see what you think about it. Like I said, I was surprised that it actually does make a difference. So you're not getting blasted with ethanol vapors. You can sort of get right in there and pick up a little bit more of those notes. So try that out, and until next time, stay thirsty.